Welcome to Creative Piecemeal Podcast, a podcast for creatives. I'm your host, Tammy Takeishi. Join me for compelling conversations with artists, actors, authors, musicians, and other creatives about the impact of the creative and fine arts in their lives and our ever-changing world. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to Creative Piecemeal Podcast. Today I am with Jeff Weddle. He is a poet, an author, and presently teaches at the University of Alabama. He has many books out and is a fabulous poet, but I'm going to turn it over to him to talk about some of his more recent releases and also how he got his start. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tammy. I'm delighted to be here. My most recent book is from Uncollected Press. It's called, what is it called? It's called Driving the Lost Highway. It's the poetry collection. And I'm really proud of it. I've got another book coming out with that press soon called Letter to Jevdet Bayrai. That book is coming out in English from Uncollected Press, and also it's coming out in Kosovo, translated into Albanian with the same title, and I'm really pleased with that.
Wow.
Other recent things. My last book before Driving the Lost Highway was from Kung Fu Treachery Press. It's called How It Went to Pieces. So that's my most recent stuff.
Yeah, and you were so kind to send me a box of your works, and I love how you come up with, I love your titles, and I realize that I'm jumping questions already. So how did you get your start? And then I really want to know, how do you think of your titles?
Well, that goes back to my childhood, probably. My mom was a college English professor. Mm-hmm. And she read to my sister and I when we were little, but she didn't just read children's books. She did that, but she would also tell us Shakespeare stories and things like The Fairy Queen from Edmund Spenser. And I remember her reading The Rime of the Ancient Mariner when I was about 7 or 8 years old. So I have a strong affinity for literature going back to my earliest days, and I always wanted to write, but I never really had much confidence in my ability. And in fact, I wrote for a long time, producing nothing but really bad stuff. When I finally had a window into actually doing something, I was in college at the University of Kentucky. I was an English major. And I lived in this wonderful old building called the Minor Dixon Apartments. In fact, the apartment that I had, the actor Harry Dean Stanton had lived in the same apartment when he was in college there in the 50s. At least that was the story I was told by my next door neighbor who should have known he lived there then too. But this building was filled with these wonderful eccentric characters, some students, some not. One fellow, my downstairs neighbor, was named John Patterson. He was an old hippie who had dropped out of law school to become a furniture mover. And he knocked on my door one day, and I opened it. There he is standing there with 2 books in his hands. One of them is Memoirs of a Shop Pornographer by Kenneth Patchen, and the other is a collection of poetry by Charles Bukowski called Mockingbird Wish Me Luck. And he said, Weddle, you got to read these. So I read them, and I loved the Patchen book, but the Bukowski book changed my life. It took the scales off my eyes for what poetry could be. As I say, I was an English major, and I was reading all the stuff that was in the canon, and it was great stuff. But I'd never read anything so free and plain spoken and human. It was like what Whitman and Wordsworth said they were trying to do. I think Bukowski achieved it. True language spoken by people. And I couldn't get enough of Bukowski after that. I was obnoxious about it. I read Bukowski obsessively for probably 20, 25 years. And some of my friends called me the Bukowski prophet. One person said that I was a Bukowskian the way some people were free will Baptists. And I just absorbed the way he wrote. And then from him, I encountered other poets. And, I wrote a lot of bad stuff then, too, that was probably closer to imitation Bukowski than anything else. But eventually, I developed my own voice, my own style. And that's really how I got started writing. I came into my own as a writer, not as a published writer, but as a writer who was really serious about it when I was a graduate student at Morehead State University back in the late 80s. I went there, and it was the first place I'd ever gone where before I showed up, I realized that I had friends waiting for me. I just knew it. I mean, I don't know how I knew it, but I did. And it was true. When I got there, I fell in with these wonderful poets and drunks and just great, great eccentric characters, and it changed my life.
Mm-hmm.
I met a fellow named Eric Cash, who was my office mate, and he and I started a literary magazine called Misnomer, which we put out for a few issues. And well, the thing is, I just started writing for real in those days, and that's when I started sending things out to magazines, started publishing, and went on from there. So that's how I got started.
Nice, nice. And I can definitely tell your influences from, leafing through some of your books. But again, back to titles, which I think are just so fascinating, because titling is really fun, but also a really difficult, at least I think, difficult part of the creative process. Whether you're titling a poem, or you're titling a chapter, or a whole book. So how does that work for you?
That's a great question, and I worry about that. I've written a lot of poems, and I sometimes worry that I've used a title more than once, and I probably have on occasion. I don't have a specific example, but I'd be amazed if I hadn't. But the thing is that the titles tend to arise organically from the poem. And so something about the story that I'm telling in the poem, or an image or a line, will jump out at me, and I will just sort of intuitively pick it, and that'll be the title of the poem. And sometimes it'll probably be more clear than others why I chose that, but that's how it works. I tend to write pretty quickly, and I don't plan out what I'm going to write, and the title just sort of evolves from the poem.
And you said you write pretty quickly. Is that how you usually do things creatively? Do you just sort of sit down when there's a moment of inspiration, or do you try to hammer things out on a regular basis? What does your creative process look like?
That's a great question. I think I would be overstating the case if I said I had a creative process. When I try to sit down and write something, it tends to come out flat and forced. I admire people who can sit down every day at the same time and write for an hour or 2 hours, or come up with X number of words or X number of pages. That discipline is great. And for those that can do it, bravo. But for me, if it's going to work, this is especially true with poetry. It's a little less true with prose, but with poetry, I sometimes I'll write 3, 4, 5 poems in a day, and sometimes I'll go weeks without writing anything. And it all comes down to a line pops into my head, and that happened to me for years, and I ignored those lines. And then one day I had a line in my head, and I wrote it down, and I kept going, and I got something good out of it. And from then on, I realized that was my process. I would wait for that line, and then I would let it come forth.
I feel like I'm the same way when it comes to writing poetry. I don't actively write poetry. Like, I'll actively engage in writing prose, and we'll sit down and decide, okay, I'm going to work on this manuscript. But when it comes to poetry or even like song lyrics or something, it's just based on like a feeling or like you said, a line that pops into your head or just something that has to like get out, and that's the only way it can get out.
Right, right. And my dad was that way too. He was a poet. Um, and when he was young, he had some startling success that he didn't really follow up on. He was a Marine and wrote a long poem while he was on the front lines in Korea called Mr. You and Mr. Me that got published in the Marine Corps magazine called The Leatherneck and was, seen all over the world by Marines. And he later published work in the Christian Science Monitor. He did some amazing things, but he didn't he didn't go that route. He became a college professor like my mom and always wrote poetry, but he didn't really pursue it in any certain way. But I think I may have inherited from him that notion of a line comes in and you go with it. That's the way he wrote as well.
Mhm. What's your favorite part about the creative process?
Oh goodness, what a great idea, or what a great question. A friend of mine once was talking about another friend, a mutual friend, said that our friend uh, didn't really like writing. He liked having written, and I think that's my favorite part too, is having written and being able to see something that I've done. And one of my favorite things, really, I don't know if this would be part of the process, but it's when I'll come across a poem that I'd forgotten that I'd written, and I'll read it, and I think, wow, that's pretty good. Where'd that come from? And I'll have no memory of it, really. That's I like it when that happens.
That's nice. Yeah. Yeah, that is nice because it's almost like you're seeing it with eyes of, like fresh eyes or eyes of like a reader, when you don't remember
Right,
your own stuff.
right. And the thing is, I barely remember writing most of my stuff. I'll look through books, and occasionally I'll find a piece that, oh yeah, I remember exactly where I was when I wrote this, or I remember what was on my mind. But so often I'll read through a collection and I'll think, when on earth did I write this one or that one? And that's okay. It's just it's kind of a mystery.
Are you'd mentioned Bukowski and Shakespeare and things from your younger years, but are there any current books or authors or poets that have really inspired you within the last year or two?
I knew you were going to ask me that. Um, I don't want to mention a whole lot of poets that I know because I know some really really fine poets, and if I start doing that, I'm going to leave people out, and I'll feel bad about it, so forth. So I'm gonna mention a couple of people that I share a publisher with, just because that's a common denominator, and if I leave people out, then they can't say I was just being mean to them. Um, I'm translated into Albanian by a fellow named Fadil Bairai. And Fadil um, is the translator responsible for introducing Beat Generation literature to the Albanian speaking world. Okay, I say that by way of saying that Fadil has also published a really, really great poet named John Yamrus. Um, I met John through Fadil, and his work is just spectacular. It's direct and spare and narrative, and I'm in awe of the way he has this deft touch of making something that's really difficult seem effortless. So John Yamrus is one of my favorites. He's great. Another really excellent poet that Fadil is currently translating is Dan Denton. Dan is he's mostly a novelist these days, but he's also a poet. And Fadil is working on some of his stuff right now. Dan is I think he's a retired UAW auto worker. He's on the poetry circuit, going around the country to readings and stuff. His work is very direct and gritty and beautiful. So Dan is excellent too. Another poet that I knew who Fadil has translated and published passed away just a few days ago.
Mm.
Do you know Neely Cherkovsky's work by any chance? Does that
No.
ring a bell? Well, Neely was he was fantastic. He was a younger friend of Bukowski's. He wrote the first Bukowski biography, and years ago when that book came out, I loved it. and I read a really bad review of it in the Village Voice. And so I wrote this piece defending the book that was published in this little zine called Sure, the Charles Bukowski newsletter. And Neely read it and got in touch with me, and we became friends. And so I knew Neely off and on for a long, long time. And his work was really good. He was always, unfortunately, in Bukowski's shadow a little bit, although their writing wasn't the same. They were just joined together through friendship and the fact that Neely had written that biography. But I'll say Neely and Dan and John are three contemporary poets that really speak to me. Another poet of recent years who died, 8 or 9 years ago probably, that was so good. Oh gosh, now I'm blanking on his name. Oh, Steve Cowett. Steve Cowett. He wrote his book that I really loved was Lurid Confessions. Really, really good. So those are some that I like quite a bit.
Nice. It's interesting that you mentioned John because he's a mutual friend, and by the time this airs, his episode would have actually already gone live. So.
Oh, yay! That's wonderful. Yeah. He's a great guy. You know, in addition to being in awe of his poetic talent and output, I'm really, really jealous of his ability to get the word out about his stuff. He is constantly busy doing things like this, and that's the way to go. I wish I had that savvy and energy that he has.
He seems to be fitting in a lot of stuff. That's for sure. So.
Yeah, he's tremendous. He's so good.
So, a little bit of a pivot. If you didn't do creative writing and poetry in your life, what would be something creative that you would like to try?
Well, I wish I could draw. I wish I could paint. My first book was actually a historical biography, a literary biography of a man named John Edgar Webb and his wife Louise Webb. They ran the Lou John Press, which was, again, going back to Bukowski, was Bukowski's first important publisher. So I really enjoyed that kind of writing. It's not creative writing in that sense, but I had a good time writing that book, good time researching it, good time writing it. So if I weren't able to write poetry or fiction, that's probably what I would turn to.
Nice. And it's always good to sort of expand your horizons and see what else that you're capable of doing, right?
Oh, absolutely. I'm one of those people who have always been sort of timid and shy about my abilities, and I'm fortunate that my parents were always very supportive and pushing me forward and letting me know that I could do things. I remember my dad when I was young. I was studying martial arts, and this may have been around the time I got my black belt. I'm not sure, but my dad said to me, just because you can do something, don't make the mistake of thinking that other people can do it as well. And what he was trying to tell me was, that you have talents, you have gifts, and not everybody has the same gifts, and you need to nurture those and become who you are.
Mm-hmm. That is great that you achieved that success in the martial arts. Do you find that any of those trainings and disciplines crossed over into your writing world?
Oh, sure. First, let me say I wish I could still do martial arts. I'm 64 now and arthritic as I can be, and so that those days are behind me. But yeah, the whole thing about martial arts is you're competing against yourself and pushing through pain and limitations and the lessons you learn on a dojo floor translate to all walks of your life. If anybody's listening to this and thinking about getting your kids into martial arts, do it. It's the best thing you could ever do for them. I can't praise my time in Taekwondo enough.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, and it's so much fun. So good for you.
I'm sure it's quite a workout.
Yes, it certainly can be. And and if you're not warmed up, you can injure yourself. Once I was in a class where we didn't warm up really well, and I ripped a groin muscle, which plagued me for about a year and a half.
Mm.
Yeah. So, well, that's neither here nor there. It was a long time ago, but
It still sounds painful, no matter how long ago that may have happened.
I feel it right now just thinking about it. And I wish that I could do music like you. I have no talent in that area.
Oh, well, thank you. I couldn't like do any karate moves or anything, so we all
I
have
am
our talents.
I'm sitting at a piano right now. We have a piano in our living room, and I do like to get on it and plunk around, knowing absolutely nothing. A friend of mine, when I was young, taught me how to play Heart and Soul, and I can do that with one finger. Just
There
the
you
one.
go. See, you play something. That's better than nothing, right?
Yeah.
Well, interesting that you mentioned music. I'd really love to sort of jump off that. Are there any bands or artists that, like, because some people listen to music when they write, or sometimes music infuses things that they write. Does that happen to you, or no? If you've been feeling burned out, stressed, overwhelmed, or exhausted, the resources and courses at the Self Care Institute are here to support you. The Self Care Institute was founded by Dr. Ami Kunimura and provides support for individuals and organizations with burnout prevention, burnout recovery, and stress management. I've personally taken a few of these courses and found them to be super helpful, both professionally and personally. The care you give yourself matters just as much as the care you give to others. But if self-care is difficult for you, you're not alone. And the Self-Care Institute is here to support your well-being, resilience, and sense of fulfillment at work and at home. For more information, visit selfcareinstitute.com or go to the show notes and click on the link.
I don't typically write with music playing or television or anything. I typically write just alone in silence. But there are certainly artists that influence my writing and my aesthetic. My favorite band of all time is the Beach Boys. I love the Beach Boys, especially the period from Pet Sounds in 1965, I think it was, through Holland in the early 70s. But their work probably doesn't, in any real way, influence the way I write. One artist that really probably influenced me more than any other in terms of how I construct a poem or story is Tom Waits. He's such a great storyteller.
Yeah.
Great poet. Yeah, he's fantastic. He and Bob Dylan and Townes Van Zandt, the people who tell stories in their songs, that really means a lot to me when people can do that well.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
Tom Waits' early stuff is it's nobody can touch it.
And of course, Bob Dylan, like you
Oh, of
mentioned,
course, yeah,
yeah.
Nobel Prize winner.
I'm gonna take a departure, and this has nothing to do with creativity whatsoever. But if you could travel anywhere in the world, where would you go?
I would probably go to Ireland. Um, my great grandmother, her name was Millie Delaney, came over from Ireland when she was 8 years old with a couple of siblings who were babies during one of the lesser potato famines, not the big one, but a lesser one. And she came over and I don't know how she did it, but she survived and was adopted into a family, and her siblings were taken somewhere else and never seen again. I'd love to go back to Ireland. I've never been there. I'd love to go to Ireland and see where she came from.
Mm, that sounds like a fascinating family history, though.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. My mom is named for her. My mom is Laura Mildred. Um, she was Laura Mildred Thomas, Mildred Weddle. She was named for both of her grandmothers. Her grandmother Laura was a full-blooded Cherokee Native American, and then of course Millie was Irish. A lot of great family stories. Do you want to hear about the time I think it was my great grandfather on my grandmother's side, on my dad's side. Anyway, the fella saw the devil. You want to hear that story?
Sure.
Okay, there was this fella. He was my ancestor of some sort. I may be mistaking exactly what he was, but he was back there, and he was sort of a wild man. He was a drinker and a carouser and hunter. And one day he'd gone hunting, and I guess he was probably drunk. Sat there in the forest by himself, and he got lost. And he was trying to find his way through the woods. It was night, and he came upon this path. Now, this story was always told to me as truth when I was growing up. I have no idea if my dad and my grandmother actually believed it, but by gosh, they told it to me. He was going through the woods and he came upon this path, and he starts down it and he goes a little way, and he sees up ahead what looks like a gate. And he gets a little closer and he sees something standing in it. And he thinks it's an animal or something, and he gets closer and closer, and he realizes, that's the devil. It's some creature standing there with horns and whatever the devil would have looked like to this man. And the way the family story goes, he got down on his knees and he prayed and he said, Lord, if you let me get past this, I will give up my evil ways and I will become a preacher. And he stood up and he steeled his nerves and he walked past this thing and he became a preacher. And that's one of the great stories in my family. It's probably completely fictitious, but whoever made it up, God bless them. It's a great story.
It certainly makes for interesting family lore regardless.
Yes.
So jumping back to you specifically, though, you teach at the University of Alabama, but you've also been really involved in library sciences and things of that nature. So can you talk a little bit more about your roles with that?
Okay. I went to library school at the University of Kentucky, not really knowing what I was getting into. I saw a story about the library school in the university newspaper, and I thought, well, that sounds interesting. So just on a whim, I applied to the program, master's degree, and took that degree. And while I was in library school, I had this wonderful girlfriend who was from Maine. She graduated before I did, and moved back to New England, got a job in New Hampshire. When I finished up, I followed her up there and was a librarian for a little bit less than a year in Concord, New Hampshire, at the Concord Public Library. I was a reference librarian. Later, I was an assistant director and then director at the Sunflower County Library in Mississippi, in the Delta, and I was there for a couple of years. And the woman who's now my wife, then my girlfriend, she had never lived any place cold, and she wanted to. So I was youngish and fancy free, and I started applying for jobs in cold places, and was offered a job in Topsom, Maine. I went from a 6-branch library system in the Delta, Mississippi Delta, to a tiny little library in an old house in small town Maine, and was there for a year or so. And Jill and I decided that we weren't really New Englanders. It's a beautiful place and a lot of nice people, but gosh, it was cold. And we missed home. We missed the South. So Jill was asking about for something to do as a career change. She was working as a newspaper writer. And I convinced her to go to library school. And we went to the University of Tennessee, where Jill did her library degree, and I did my doctorate in communication. And when I finished up, the director of the library school at Tennessee had moved to being the director of the library school at the University of Alabama, Elizabeth Aversa, and she recruited me to apply for an open faculty position here, and I did, and they hired me, and so I've been here. It'll be 20 years at the end of this semester.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I've had a couple of librarians on the show, but you're the first one who's also like a librarian plus a active writer and a professor. Like, so everyone's sort of got their own niches in what they do, but I love librarians.
Yeah, they tend to be weird people and wonderful people, and I got very lucky with my writing and my job. When I first came to Alabama, um, we were a smaller university, and we weren't then what's called an R1 university or Research One university. There was a huge premium put on publishing scholarly stuff, but you could also count other things that weren't, you know, that sort of thing, the journal articles and so forth. And from the beginning, my creative work was accepted as part of my output. And once I got tenure, I kept publishing that, and they kept counting. So I stopped really doing the other stuff. And so for the last few years, I've just been writing and publishing poetry and some fiction. And I feel like I really gamed the system in a great way for me. I get to do the job and publish what I want, and make a name for myself in the way that feels right for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have to do that other stuff.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Well, a couple more questions. One is, what is something that you are most proud of with your writing?
I'll have to answer this in a couple of different ways. I'm proud of the fact that I've never really quit. I've gone through long dry spells, but I've just kept doing it. I always hope that I'll write a poem that is going to be really, really good, the kind of thing that people would remember. And I don't think that I've achieved anything like that, but I'm proud of the fact that I keep trying. I think the thing that I'm most proud of is probably that first book, Bohemian New Orleans. It got it was really well received, and it spurred a documentary that was well reviewed and played at film festivals and so forth. So I'm really proud of that, and I'm proud that I was able to write a collection of short fiction. Writing fiction is very difficult for me. It's like pulling teeth, and I'm glad I was able to get that done and get it out in the world.
So, one final question. In your own words, what does living a creative life mean to you?
It means living an honest life, um, honoring who you are, and I write for no one but myself. I don't ever have an audience in mind. Um, I don't have trends in mind or causes in mind. I write what's inside me, and it pops out. And sometimes it's political, uh, or will be a comment on something that's happening now. But it's not in a calculated way. So I think living a creative life for me is just being open and honest, and knowing that we're all the universe looking back at itself, and having that conversation with yourself is having the conversation with all there is, and in an odd sort of way. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I got for you.
Excellent. Thank you. Jeff, thank you so much for being on the show. Listeners, please check the show notes for links to purchase his books as well as his bio. Jeff, is there anything else you'd like to tell our audience before we go?
Well, yes. I want to tell you very quickly about my mom, who is a fiction writer. She's 90 years old, living here in Tuscaloosa in assisted living, and her collected stories has just been published. She had a couple of short story collections that had gone out of print, and they've just been reissued as her collected stories by Sacred Chickens Press, and her name's Laura Weddle, and you can find her book on Amazon, and you're nuts if you don't get it. It's a great book. So that's that.
Excellent. I'll go ahead and include that link as well. That's wonderful. She's got something going. So
she does. She's wonderful.
Awesome. Well, listeners, again, check those show notes, support the Weddles, and as always, thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Like the show? Have a question? Stop by the Facebook and Instagram pages. Links are in the show notes, or search for Creative Piecemeal Podcast on social media and click follow for all the latest.